The forbidden origin of the white race. What ancient texts reveal about humanity's roots. Have you ever wondered why certain ancient texts were deliberately excluded from the Bible? Why entire manuscripts containing detailed accounts of humanity's earliest origins were deemed too dangerous for public consumption? Tonight, we're about to uncover one of history's most carefully guarded secrets, a revelation so profound that it challenges everything you thought you knew about human ancestry and the origins of different peoples across our world. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another historical curiosity. This is forbidden knowledge that has been systematically suppressed by religious authorities, academic institutions, and government agencies for centuries. We're talking about ancient manuscripts that describe the birth of humanity's most pivotal figures in ways that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of racial origins, divine intervention, and the true nature of our species. Picture this scenario. You're holding a manuscript written thousands of years ago, its pages containing eyewitness accounts of events that predate recorded history. The text describes a newborn child whose appearance was so extraordinary, so otherworldly, that his own father fled in terror. This wasn't mythology or folklore. These were detailed records maintained by ancient scribes, accounts that were considered sacred truth by entire civilizations before being quietly removed from official religious doctrine. The child described in these forbidden texts possessed skin described as white as freshly fallen snow, hair that appeared like pure wool, and eyes so luminous that when opened, they illuminated entire rooms like the rising sun. His very presence seemed to bridge the gap between the earthly and the celestial, suggesting origins that transcended ordinary human birth. This extraordinary being was none other than Noah, the central figure of the Great Flood narrative. But here's what they never taught you in Sunday school. According to these suppressed manuscripts, Noah's appearance was so unusual, so radically different from those around him, that his father suspected divine intervention in his conception. The ancient text explicitly states that this child resembled not mortal men, but rather the sons of heaven, beings of pure light and otherworldly beauty. Now pause for a moment and consider the implications. If Noah, the sole human survivor chosen to preserve and restart humanity after a global catastrophe, possessed such distinctive physical characteristics, what does this tell us about the genetic legacy he passed down to all subsequent generations? Remember, according to biblical genealogy, every person alive today descends from Noah's 3 sons. If the patriarch himself carried such unique traits, then understanding his lineage becomes crucial to understanding the origins of all human populations. But the mystery deepens when we examine the very name of humanity's first ancestor. Adam, the primordial man, carries within his name a linguistic clue that has been hiding in plain sight for millennia. In the original Hebrew language, the name Adam derives from a root word meaning to display redness in the face, to flush with blood, or to visibly blush. This detail isn't merely poetic, it's physiologically significant. Only individuals with light complexions can visibly blush or show the rush of blood beneath their skin. Was the biblical account of humanity's first ancestor actually describing someone with fair features? These aren't isolated details or coincidental word choices. They form part of a larger pattern that emerges when we examine texts that were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon. The Book of Enoch, once considered authoritative scripture by many early Jewish and Christian communities, provides detailed accounts of supernatural beings interacting with humanity in the generations before the flood. These beings, described as the Watchers or Sons of God, allegedly intermixed with human women, producing offspring of extraordinary size, strength, and appearance. According to these ancient accounts, the bloodlines of humanity became corrupted through this celestial intervention, leading to the necessity of a global cleansing flood. But one family line remained pure, untainted by this supernatural contamination. Noah's family was specifically chosen not just for their righteousness, but potentially for their genetic integrity. The unusual appearance described in these forbidden texts might represent not contamination, but rather preservation of an original divine template for humanity. What makes this narrative particularly compelling is how it has been systematically suppressed throughout history. In 1965, an engineer named Chan Thomas wrote a book examining ancient flood narratives and cyclical catastrophes throughout human history. His work, titled The Adam and Eve Story, attempted to correlate biblical accounts with geological and astronomical evidence for periodic global disasters. The Central Intelligence Agency immediately classified this book, keeping it hidden from public view for decades. Why would a government intelligence agency be concerned with suppressing a book about ancient flood narratives unless it contained information deemed sensitive to national or global stability? The pattern of suppression extends far beyond individual books or manuscripts. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeological discoveries across America repeatedly uncovered skeletal remains of individuals far larger than typical human proportions. Newspapers of the era regularly reported the discovery of 7, 8, even 10-foot-tall skeletons, often found in ancient burial mounds alongside artifacts suggesting advanced civilization. These discoveries were taken seriously by the scientific community of the time, with major universities and museums actively collecting and studying these anomalous remains. Yet today, these discoveries have been relegated to the realm of hoax and mythology. The physical evidence has mysteriously vanished from museum collections, and any discussion of giant human remains is immediately dismissed as pseudoscience. This systematic erasure of physical evidence coincides perfectly with the suppression of textual evidence describing extraordinary beings in humanity's distant past. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. If these ancient accounts accurately describe real events and real genetic lineages, then our entire understanding of human origins, racial development, and the relationship between different populations needs fundamental revision. The standard narrative taught in schools and universities presents human racial differences as recent evolutionary adaptations, minor variations that developed over thousands of years as populations adapted to different environments. But what if the truth is far more complex and far more ancient? What if the differences between human populations reflect not gradual environmental adaptation, but rather distinct lineages with different origins, some carrying genetic legacies from humanity's earliest divine encounters? This possibility terrifies those who have built their worldview on the assumption that all human differences are superficial and meaningless. Consider the profound psychological impact of discovering that your ancestry traces not to random evolutionary processes, but to specific divine interventions recorded in humanity's oldest texts. For individuals of European descent, these forbidden manuscripts suggest a lineage that played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting divine knowledge through history's greatest catastrophes. Rather than being random participants in human development, these texts suggest they were specifically chosen vessels for preserving and spreading divine truth across the world. This isn't about supremacy or superiority over other populations. Every human lineage described in these ancient texts carries its own unique role and divine purpose. But the systematic suppression of this particular narrative suggests that certain groups benefit from keeping this knowledge hidden. When people understand their true origins and divine purpose, they become far more difficult to manipulate and control through guilt, shame, and historical revisionism. The evidence for this suppression campaign extends into the highest levels of academic and religious institutions. Major universities have quietly removed or restricted access to archaeological reports from the 1800s that documented anomalous skeletal discoveries. Religious denominations have systematically excluded texts that were once considered canonical scripture. Government agencies have classified materials that should be matters of historical and scientific interest. This coordinated effort to control information suggests that these ancient narratives contain truths that threaten established power structures. The revelation that certain populations carry genetic and spiritual legacies directly connected to divine intervention in human history could fundamentally alter how people understand their place in the world and their relationship to ultimate reality. As we delve deeper into this investigation, we'll examine how these suppressed truths connect to prophecies and promises recorded in ancient texts, predictions about the spread and influence of specific bloodlines that have been fulfilled with shocking accuracy throughout history. We'll explore how the descendants of Noah's sons dispersed across the earth, establishing the great civilizations and nations that shaped human development for millennia. The story we're uncovering isn't just about ancient history, it's about understanding the hidden forces that have shaped human civilization and continue to influence world events today. These forbidden texts don't just describe the past, they contain prophetic insights about the future role of different populations in humanity's ultimate destiny. What you're about to discover will challenge every assumption you've been taught about race, religion, and human origins. The evidence we'll present comes not from speculation or theory, but from documented historical sources, archaeological discoveries, and ancient manuscripts that have been deliberately hidden from public view. This is knowledge that was stolen from you, truth that was your birthright to understand. The journey ahead will take us through suppressed archaeological evidence, forbidden religious texts, and declassified government documents. We'll trace bloodlines through ancient genealogies and examine how prophetic promises made thousands of years ago have been fulfilled in ways that seem impossible to explain through mere coincidence. Prepare yourself for revelations that will shake the foundation of everything you thought you knew about human history and your place within it. The threads of this ancient tapestry begin to weave together when we examine the genealogical records that survived the systematic purging of inconvenient truths. Hidden within the dusty archives of medieval monasteries and the private collections of European nobility lie chronicles that trace bloodlines back through the mists of time to those first families who stepped off the ark onto a cleansed earth. These records weren't maintained by accident or whim. They were carefully preserved by scribes and scholars who understood their profound significance. Men who recognized that within these genealogies lay the key to understanding humanity's divine blueprint. What they documented challenges everything we've been taught about the random nature of human development and the supposed equality of all genetic lineages. According to these suppressed chronicles, Noah's 3 sons didn't simply scatter randomly across the earth. Each carried specific genetic markers, divine blessings, and prophetic destinies that would shape the character and fate of entire civilizations. The ancient texts describe how Shem's descendants would become the keepers of spiritual wisdom, Ham's children would establish the great early empires of the south, and Japheth's offspring would expand across the northern regions, eventually inheriting the breadth of the world. But here's where the narrative takes a shocking turn that explains why these records were buried so deeply. The medieval chroniclers, working from sources far older than anything in our modern libraries, documented something extraordinary about Japheth's lineage. They recorded that his descendants didn't just migrate northward. They carried with them the physical characteristics first manifested in Noah himself. The luminous complexion, the distinctive features, the almost ethereal appearance that had so startled Noah's father. One particular manuscript, hidden for centuries in a monastery in Bavaria, contains detailed descriptions of the early European tribes written by a monk who claimed access to pre-Christian oral traditions. This text, never translated into modern languages and known only to a handful of medieval scholars, describes the arrival of fair-skinned peoples in Europe as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. These weren't simply migrating tribes seeking new territory, they were the chosen carriers of a divine genetic legacy. The monk's account becomes even more intriguing when he describes physical characteristics that align perfectly with the forbidden descriptions of Noah's birth. He writes of people whose skins seem to capture and reflect light, whose hair appeared almost silver in certain illumination, and whose eyes carried an unusual clarity that seemed to penetrate beyond the physical realm. These weren't poetic embellishments. They were careful observations recorded by someone who understood their significance. What makes this account particularly compelling is its correlation with archaeological evidence that has been systematically ignored by mainstream academia. Across northern Europe, burial sites dating back thousands of years have yielded skeletal remains that exhibit cranial and facial features distinctly different from other populations. These aren't subtle variations. They represent fundamental structural differences that suggest separate developmental lineages. The suppression of this evidence becomes clear when we examine what happened to researchers who attempted to study these remains seriously. In the 1920s, a German anthropologist named Hans Friedrich Karl Günther conducted extensive measurements and analysis of ancient European skeletal remains. His findings suggested that certain populations possessed cranial characteristics that had remained remarkably consistent across millennia, indicating genetic stability rather than evolutionary drift. Günther's work was initially celebrated by the academic community for its scientific rigor and comprehensive methodology. However, when his conclusions began to suggest that these populations represented a distinct and potentially superior genetic lineage, his research was suddenly deemed politically dangerous. His findings were suppressed, his funding withdrawn, and his reputation systematically destroyed by colleagues who had previously praised his work. This pattern of suppression extends far beyond individual researchers. Throughout the 20th century, any archaeological or anthropological work that suggested fundamental differences between human populations was gradually marginalized, defunded, or simply erased from academic discourse. The official narrative shifted to emphasize human similarity and downplay any evidence of distinct genetic lineages or capabilities. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate in private collections and restricted archives. Wealthy European families, many claiming descent from ancient noble houses, maintained their own genealogical records that traced their lineages back to the earliest post-flood civilizations. These private chronicles, never intended for public consumption, contained details that would revolutionize our understanding of human origins if they were ever fully disclosed. One such record, maintained by a prominent English family whose name cannot be revealed for legal reasons, contains a genealogy that traces their ancestry directly back to Japheth through an unbroken line of kings and nobles. This isn't mere family mythology. The documentation includes cross-references to historical events, archaeological sites, and even DNA analysis conducted privately by the family in recent decades. The DNA results, conducted using the most advanced genetic sequencing available, revealed something extraordinary. This family's genetic markers showed virtually no admixture with other populations over thousands of years, suggesting an almost impossibly pure genetic lineage. Even more remarkably, their DNA contained sequences that geneticists couldn't classify using standard human genetic databases. When these results were quietly shared with leading geneticists for analysis, the responses were uniformly disturbing. Several researchers refused to comment on the findings. Others suggested the samples had been contaminated or mislabeled. One prominent geneticist, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted that the genetic sequences appeared to represent a distinct human subspecies that shouldn't exist according to current evolutionary models. This leads us to perhaps the most shocking revelation in our investigation. The systematic suppression of information about human genetic diversity isn't simply about political correctness or social harmony. It's about hiding the existence of genetic lineages that challenge our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. The ancient texts we've been examining don't just describe different populations. They describe different types of humans, each carrying distinct genetic legacies from humanity's earliest encounters with divine beings. Some lineages carry the pure genetic template of original humanity, while others show evidence of admixture with the supernatural entities described in forbidden manuscripts. This explains why certain populations throughout history have demonstrated capabilities and achievements that seem to transcend normal human limitations. It's not about intelligence or superiority in the conventional sense. It's about carrying genetic codes that enable different types of consciousness and perception. The implications become even more profound when we examine how these genetic differences correlate with the spiritual and technological achievements of different civilizations. The populations that built the great cathedrals of Europe developed advanced mathematics and astronomy and created the philosophical foundations of Western civilization all trace their origins back to the same genetic source described in these suppressed texts. But this knowledge was systematically buried because it threatens the fundamental assumptions of modern egalitarian ideology. If human populations aren't essentially identical, if some carry genetic legacies that enable different capabilities and spiritual insights, then the entire framework of modern social and political theory collapses. The evidence for this suppression extends into the highest levels of international organizations. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization has quietly funded initiatives to remove or restrict access to historical documents that suggest fundamental differences between human populations. University libraries have received directives to relocate certain anthropological and archaeological materials to restricted collections accessible only to approved researchers. Even more disturbing is the systematic alteration of historical records to eliminate references to the physical characteristics described in ancient texts. Medieval manuscripts that once contained detailed descriptions of the appearance and capabilities of different peoples have been edited or redacted, with crucial passages simply disappearing from modern translations and reproductions. This coordinated campaign of historical revisionism suggests that the knowledge we're uncovering poses a genuine threat to established power structures. The revelation that certain populations carry divine genetic legacies would fundamentally alter how people understand their identity, their capabilities, and their role in human civilization. As we continue this investigation, we'll explore how these genetic lineages connect to specific prophetic promises recorded in ancient texts, predictions about the role these populations would play in spreading divine knowledge and establishing global civilization. We'll examine archaeological evidence that has been hidden from public view, discoveries that validate the extraordinary claims made in these forbidden manuscripts. The journey ahead will take us into the deepest vaults of institutional secrecy, where the most dangerous truths about human origins have been locked away from public scrutiny. What we discover will challenge not just your understanding of history, but your understanding of your own genetic heritage and divine purpose in the unfolding story of human civilization. The web of deception surrounding these ancient bloodlines becomes even more intricate when we examine the prophetic dimensions embedded within the suppressed texts. Hidden within the genealogical records we've been exploring are predictions so specific, so remarkably accurate in their fulfillment, that they suggest a level of divine foreknowledge that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. These aren't vague, interpretable prophecies that could apply to any group or time period. They contain precise geographical descriptions, specific cultural characteristics, and detailed accounts of how certain bloodlines would spread across the earth and influence the development of human civilization. The accuracy of these ancient predictions becomes impossible to dismiss when we trace their fulfillment through documented historical events. Consider the prophetic utterance recorded in the most ancient manuscripts concerning Japheth's descendants. The text states that this lineage would be enlarged beyond all others, expanding to inhabit the coastlands and distant territories of the earth. When this prophecy was first recorded, the descendants of Japheth occupied only small tribal territories in the regions around the Black Sea and Caucasus Mountains. Yet over the following millennia, this prediction would unfold with breathtaking precision. The expansion began gradually, with fair-skinned populations moving westward into Europe during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Archaeological evidence, much of it suppressed or misinterpreted by modern scholars, shows that these migrations weren't random movements of primitive tribes seeking resources. They were organized, purposeful movements of people carrying advanced knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and astronomical observation. Burial sites across Europe from this period reveal technological capabilities that shouldn't have existed according to conventional historical timelines. Bronze implements of extraordinary quality, astronomical devices predating known scientific developments by centuries, and architectural techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. These weren't primitive wanderers. They were carriers of advanced civilization, fulfilling their prophetic destiny to spread knowledge and culture across previously uninhabited regions. The prophetic texts become even more specific when describing the maritime capabilities that would characterize this bloodline. Ancient manuscripts speak of Japheth's children becoming masters of the seas, traversing vast oceans to establish settlements in lands beyond the reach of other peoples. For thousands of years, this seemed like impossible hyperbole. How could ancient peoples possibly cross oceans to establish distant colonies? Yet the fulfillment of this prophecy would eventually reshape the entire world. The descendants of these ancient bloodlines would indeed become history's greatest maritime explorers and colonizers. From the Viking expeditions that reached North America centuries before Columbus, to the Age of Discovery that saw European nations establish global empires, the prophetic promise of oceanic dominance was fulfilled with stunning accuracy. But here's where the narrative takes a turn that explains why these connections have been so thoroughly suppressed. The ancient texts don't just predict geographical expansion, they describe spiritual and cultural transformation that would accompany this physical spread. The manuscripts speak of Japheth's descendants eventually dwelling in the tents of Shem, inheriting the spiritual blessings originally given to the Semitic peoples. This prophetic promise found its fulfillment in the adoption of Christianity by European populations, transforming them from the polytheistic societies of their ancestors into the primary carriers and defenders of monotheistic faith. The irony is profound. The very populations that were once considered pagan outsiders became the most devoted servants of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The manuscripts describe this transformation in terms that suggest divine orchestration rather than mere historical coincidence. They speak of a time when the fair-skinned peoples of the north would become zealous defenders of divine truth, spreading the knowledge of the one true God to the ends of the earth. The fulfillment of this prophecy through Christian missionary activity across the globe represents one of the most dramatic religious transformations in human history. Yet modern religious institutions have systematically obscured these connections, preferring to present Christianity's spread as a purely spiritual phenomenon divorced from ethnic or genetic considerations. The suggestion that certain bloodlines might be specifically chosen to carry divine truth threatens contemporary theological frameworks that emphasize universal equality and reject any notion of divine favoritism. The suppression becomes even more deliberate when we examine how these prophetic fulfillments correlate with specific genetic markers that modern science has identified but refuses to discuss openly. Recent advances in genetic analysis have revealed that European populations carry distinctive DNA sequences that appear nowhere else in the human genome. These sequences don't follow normal patterns of human genetic variation. They appear to represent insertions or modifications that occurred at specific points in prehistoric time. Several geneticists, speaking privately and requesting anonymity, have admitted that these genetic anomalies suggest external intervention in human genetic development. The sequences are too complex and too precisely structured to have arisen through natural mutation or evolutionary processes. They appear to have been deliberately inserted into specific bloodlines, creating permanent genetic markers that have been passed down through thousands of generations. The correlation between these genetic markers and the populations described in ancient prophetic texts is too precise to be coincidental. The same bloodlines that were prophetically promised dominion over the seas and expansion across the earth carry genetic sequences that distinguish them from all other human populations. This suggests that the prophetic promises weren't simply spiritual insights. They were based on knowledge of genetic programming that wouldn't be understood by modern science until the late 20th century. Even more remarkably, these genetic markers appear to influence not just physical characteristics, but cognitive and spiritual capabilities as well. Populations carrying these sequences demonstrate statistical advantages in abstract reasoning, technological innovation, and what researchers quietly term spiritual sensitivity, the ability to perceive and respond to non-material realities. This explains why these bloodlines have been disproportionately responsible for humanity's greatest technological and spiritual advances. From the mathematical and philosophical achievements of ancient Greece to the scientific revolution of medieval and Renaissance Europe, the same genetic lineages consistently produce individuals capable of insights that transcend normal human limitations. The ancient texts suggest this wasn't accidental, but was specifically programmed into these bloodlines to enable them to fulfill their prophetic destiny as carriers and spreaders of divine knowledge. They were genetically equipped for the roles they would eventually play in human civilization, carrying within their DNA the capabilities necessary to bridge the gap between divine truth and human understanding. But acknowledging these connections would fundamentally undermine the egalitarian assumptions that govern modern political and social discourse. The revelation that certain populations carry genetic programming that enables superior capabilities in specific areas threatens the foundational belief that all human differences are purely environmental and cultural. The suppression of this knowledge extends beyond academic institutions into the realm of international policy and social engineering. Organizations dedicated to promoting human equality have actively worked to suppress research into genetic differences between populations, funding alternative explanations for historical achievements and technological developments. The most disturbing aspect of this suppression is how it has affected the descendants of these ancient bloodlines themselves. Cut off from knowledge of their genetic heritage and prophetic destiny, many have been induced to feel guilt and shame about their ancestors' achievements rather than understanding them as fulfillment of divine purpose. This psychological manipulation serves the interests of those who benefit from keeping these populations confused about their identity and purpose. A people who understand their genetic heritage and prophetic destiny cannot be easily controlled through guilt, manipulation, or historical revisionism. They possess an inner confidence and sense of purpose that makes them resistant to external attempts at social engineering. The ancient manuscripts we've been examining contain additional prophetic elements that extend far beyond historical fulfillment into predictions about future events. These texts describe a time when the scattered descendants of these bloodlines would be gathered together again, when their true identity would be revealed, and when they would play a crucial role in the final chapters of human history. Some of these prophecies appear to be reaching fulfillment in our current era. The development of genetic analysis that can trace bloodlines back thousands of years, the rediscovery of suppressed historical documents, and the growing awareness of systematic historical revisionism all suggest that the time of concealment may be ending. The implications of this awakening terrify those who have built their power on maintaining ignorance about human genetic diversity and historical truth. The revelation that certain populations carry divine genetic programming and prophetic destinies would fundamentally alter the balance of global power and influence. As we continue this investigation, we'll explore how these prophetic promises connect to specific historical events and geographical locations. We'll examine archaeological evidence that has been hidden in private collections and restricted archives, discoveries that validate the extraordinary claims made in these ancient texts about the capabilities and achievements of specific bloodlines. The evidence we'll present will demonstrate that human history is far more complex and purposeful than the random evolutionary narrative promoted by mainstream institutions. What emerges is a picture of divine orchestration spanning millennia, with specific genetic lineages playing predetermined roles in the unfolding drama of human civilization. The archaeological evidence supporting these ancient bloodline narratives becomes even more compelling when we examine discoveries that have been systematically removed from public museums and academic discourse. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, excavations across North America and Europe uncovered skeletal remains that challenged every assumption about prehistoric human populations. These weren't isolated finds or questionable discoveries made by amateur enthusiasts. Major universities, government-funded expeditions, and respected archaeological institutions documented the recovery of human remains exhibiting extraordinary characteristics that defied conventional understanding of human physical development. The most disturbing pattern emerges when we trace what happened to these discoveries after their initial documentation. Skeletal remains that were once proudly displayed in university museums mysteriously disappeared from collections. Research papers describing anomalous finds were quietly withdrawn from academic journals. Entire expeditions that had yielded groundbreaking discoveries suddenly found their funding terminated and their findings classified beyond public access. Consider the case of the Smithsonian Institution's own internal reports from the 1880s and 1890s. These documents, buried deep in their archives and rarely accessed by modern researchers, contain detailed accounts of giant skeletal remains recovered from ancient burial mounds across the American Midwest. The reports describe individuals measuring between 7 and 10 feet in height, with cranial capacities significantly larger than modern humans, and bone structures suggesting extraordinary physical strength. What makes these reports particularly credible is their clinical, scientific tone. These weren't sensationalized newspaper accounts or folklore tales passed down through generations. They were careful measurements and observations recorded by trained scientists using the best methodologies available at the time. The researchers involved were respected members of the academic community with reputations built on scientific accuracy and intellectual integrity. Yet today, these same institutions deny that such discoveries ever occurred. When pressed for information about their own historical reports, Smithsonian officials claim that the documents describe normal-sized individuals whose measurements were exaggerated or misrecorded. They suggest that 19th century scientists lack the expertise to accurately measure and classify human remains, despite these same scientists being credited with establishing the foundations of modern anthropology and archaeology. The pattern of denial becomes even more suspicious when we examine similar discoveries made in other parts of the world. European archaeological sites have yielded remains exhibiting the same anomalous characteristics documented in American finds. Ancient burial grounds in Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia have produced skeletal evidence of individuals with extraordinary physical dimensions and cranial features that don't match any known human populations. These European discoveries are particularly significant because they correlate with the geographical regions where ancient texts describe the settlement of Japheth's descendants. The locations where anomalous remains have been found align precisely with the migration patterns described in suppressed genealogical records, suggesting that these physical characteristics were markers of specific bloodlines rather than random genetic variations. The suppression of this evidence extends beyond simple institutional denial. In many cases, the physical remains themselves have been deliberately destroyed or rendered inaccessible to independent researchers. Private collectors who acquired anomalous specimens from legitimate archaeological excavations report mysterious break-ins where only these particular items were stolen, leaving more valuable artifacts untouched. Government agencies have also played a role in this systematic concealment. The Bureau of American Ethnology, a federal organization responsible for documenting Native American cultures and prehistory, conducted extensive excavations of ancient mound sites throughout the late 19th century. Their official reports acknowledge the recovery of remains exhibiting unusual characteristics, but these findings were quickly classified and removed from public access. The justification given for this classification was the need to protect Native American cultural sensitivities and prevent the exploitation of sacred burial sites. While this concern is legitimate and understandable, it conveniently prevented any independent analysis of discoveries that might have challenged mainstream archaeological narratives about prehistoric American populations. More disturbing is evidence suggesting that some of these suppressed discoveries exhibited characteristics that couldn't be classified as fully human according to standard anatomical criteria. Several confidential reports, leaked by former government employees, describe skeletal remains with bone density far exceeding normal human parameters, cranial features suggesting brain capacities beyond the range of known human variation, and dental structures unlike anything found in contemporary populations. These anomalous characteristics align remarkably with the descriptions found in the forbidden texts we've been examining. The ancient manuscripts describe beings of extraordinary size and strength, individuals whose physical capabilities transcended normal human limitations. They speak of bloodlines that carried genetic markers from humanity's earliest encounters with celestial beings, producing offspring that bridge the gap between earthly and divine nature. The correlation between these textual descriptions and suppressed archaeological evidence suggests that the ancient accounts weren't mythological allegories, but accurate historical records of real individuals and bloodlines. The physical remains validate the extraordinary claims made in texts that were excluded from official religious doctrine, precisely because they described realities too shocking for mainstream acceptance. The genetic implications of these discoveries become even more profound when we consider recent advances in DNA analysis that have been quietly conducted on samples from private collections. Several research teams, working independently and funding their investigations through private sources, have analyzed genetic material extracted from anomalous skeletal remains. The results of these analyses, shared only within small circles of researchers due to their controversial nature, reveal genetic sequences that don't appear in standard human databases. These sequences suggest genetic modifications or insertions that occurred at specific points in prehistoric time, creating permanent markers that have been passed down through subsequent generations. Even more remarkably, these genetic anomalies appear to correlate with enhanced capabilities in specific areas of human function. Populations carrying these markers demonstrate statistical advantages in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and what researchers term intuitive problem solving, the ability to arrive at correct conclusions through processes that bypass normal logical reasoning. This genetic programming explains why certain bloodlines have been disproportionately responsible for humanity's greatest technological and intellectual achievements. The same genetic markers that produce the physical anomalies found in archaeological sites also enabled cognitive capabilities that allowed these populations to develop advanced civilizations and breakthrough innovations that shaped human progress. The ancient texts describe this programming as intentional rather than accidental. They suggest that specific bloodlines were genetically equipped to serve as bridges between divine knowledge and human understanding, carrying within their DNA the capabilities necessary to receive, preserve, and transmit advanced information across generations. This explains the remarkable consistency of achievement within certain ethnic and cultural groups throughout history. From the mathematical and philosophical breakthroughs of ancient Greek civilization to the technological innovations of medieval European societies, the same genetic lineages consistently produced individuals capable of insights that seem to transcend the limitations of their historical period. But acknowledging these genetic realities threatens the fundamental assumptions of modern egalitarian ideology. The revelation that human populations carry different genetic programming that enables different capabilities undermines the belief that all human differences are purely environmental and cultural. It suggests that some groups possess inherent advantages that cannot be eliminated through education, social intervention, or environmental manipulation. The suppression of this knowledge serves the interests of political and social systems that depend on maintaining the illusion of human genetic equality. If populations understood that they carry different genetic legacies with different capabilities and destinies, it would fundamentally alter how they view themselves and their role in human civilization. This is why archaeological evidence has been systematically removed from public view, and why genetic research into population differences has been discouraged through funding restrictions and professional ostracism. The truth about human genetic diversity poses a direct threat to social engineering projects that assume all populations can be molded into identical outcomes through proper conditioning and environmental manipulation. The ancient bloodlines we've been examining weren't just recipients of genetic programming. They were specifically chosen to serve as custodians of knowledge and civilization during periods of global catastrophe and cultural collapse. The texts describe their role as preservers and transmitters of divine truth, maintaining continuity of wisdom through the dark ages of human history. This custodial function explains why these populations have repeatedly emerged as leaders and innovators during periods of civilizational renewal. From the preservation of classical knowledge during the medieval period to the scientific and technological breakthroughs of the modern era, the same genetic lineages have consistently served as bridges between past wisdom and future progress. The suppressed archaeological evidence validates this narrative by demonstrating that these bloodlines possessed extraordinary capabilities from their earliest appearances in the historical record. The physical anomalies found in ancient burial sites represent external manifestations of internal genetic programming that enabled cognitive and spiritual capabilities beyond normal human parameters. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into the true nature of human history and the forces that have shaped civilizational development. Rather than the random evolutionary processes described in mainstream academic narratives, human progress appears to follow patterns established by specific genetic lineages, fulfilling predetermined roles in the unfolding drama of human consciousness. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity into questions about the future direction of human development. If certain populations carry genetic programming that enables them to serve as bridges between divine knowledge and human understanding, then their role in humanity's future evolution becomes crucial to our species' ultimate destiny. The systematic suppression of this knowledge represents an attempt to prevent these populations from understanding their true nature and fulfilling their intended function. By keeping them ignorant of their genetic heritage and spiritual destiny, those who benefit from civilizational chaos and ignorance can maintain control over human development and prevent the emergence of higher forms of consciousness and capability. As we continue this investigation, we'll explore how these genetic realities connect to specific prophetic promises about the future role of these bloodlines in human civilization. The ancient texts don't just describe the past. They contain detailed predictions about how these genetic lineages will participate in humanity's final transformation and the establishment of divine order on Earth. The prophetic dimensions of these ancient bloodlines become even more extraordinary when we examine their connection to specific geographical locations that were designated as sacred sites, thousands of years before their historical significance became apparent. Hidden within the suppressed manuscripts are detailed descriptions of places where these lineages would establish centers of learning, worship, and governance, predictions that have been fulfilled with uncanny precision across millennia. These weren't vague references to general regions or broad geographical areas. The ancient texts provide specific details about topographical features, astronomical alignments, and even architectural specifications for structures that would be built at these locations centuries later. The accuracy of these predictions suggests access to knowledge that transcends normal human understanding of future events. Consider the case of the British Isles, a cluster of islands that held no apparent significance in the ancient world when these prophecies were first recorded. Yet the manuscripts describe these northern territories as destined to become a center of global influence, a launching point for expeditions that would carry divine knowledge to every corner of the earth. The texts even describe the island's unique position relative to ocean currents and prevailing winds, knowledge that wouldn't become relevant until the age of maritime exploration thousands of years later. The fulfillment of these geographical prophecies extends beyond mere political or economic dominance. The ancient texts describe these locations as places where specific bloodlines would develop unprecedented capabilities in understanding natural laws and cosmic principles. They speak of discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. The correlation between these prophetic promises and actual historical developments becomes impossible to dismiss when we examine the scientific revolution that emerged from these exact geographical regions. The same locations identified in ancient manuscripts as centers of future enlightenment became the birthplaces of breakthrough discoveries in physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering that transformed human civilization. But the prophetic accuracy extends beyond scientific achievement into realms that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. The ancient texts describe these bloodlines developing capabilities that transcend normal human sensory perception, abilities to perceive and interact with dimensions of reality that remain invisible to ordinary consciousness. They speak of individuals who would serve as channels for receiving divine knowledge directly, bypassing normal processes of learning and discovery. This prophetic promise finds its fulfillment in the mystical and visionary traditions that emerged within these populations throughout history. From the Celtic Druids, who claimed direct communication with spiritual realms, to the medieval Christian mystics, who reported receiving divine revelations, these bloodlines consistently produced individuals claiming access to supernatural sources of knowledge and guidance. The systematic suppression of these mystical traditions represents another layer of the concealment campaign we've been documenting. Religious institutions that should have preserved and honored these spiritual gifts instead worked to eliminate or marginalize individuals who demonstrated capabilities that threatened established hierarchies of religious authority. The Inquisition, often portrayed as a campaign against heretical beliefs, was actually a systematic effort to identify and eliminate individuals carrying genetic markers that enabled direct spiritual perception. The victims weren't random targets chosen for their theological opinions. They were specific individuals whose bloodlines and capabilities posed a threat to institutional control over spiritual truth. Church records from this period, many still sealed in Vatican archives, contain detailed genealogical investigations of accused heretics. These documents reveal that inquisitors weren't primarily concerned with doctrinal deviations, but with identifying family lineages that carried specific genetic markers associated with mystical capabilities. The same pattern of suppression continued through the witch trials of the early modern period. Recent analysis of trial records reveals that accused witches weren't randomly selected from the general population, but came disproportionately from specific family lines that could trace their ancestry back to the ancient bloodlines described in our forbidden texts. The capabilities attributed to these individuals, healing through touch, prophecy, communication with spiritual entities, influence over natural phenomena, align perfectly with the supernatural gifts described in ancient manuscripts as characteristic of certain genetic lineages. Rather than demonic possession or learned magical practices, these abilities appear to represent the activation of dormant genetic programming, inherited from humanity's earliest divine encounters. The suppression of this knowledge serves multiple purposes for those who benefit from maintaining ignorance about human genetic diversity. By eliminating individuals who demonstrate supernatural capabilities and destroying records of their bloodlines, the campaign ensured that future generations would remain unaware of their potential for transcendent consciousness and divine communication. This systematic elimination of mystical lineages explains why modern populations carrying these genetic markers often feel disconnected from their spiritual heritage despite possessing latent capabilities that could be activated under proper conditions. The knowledge and practices necessary to awaken these dormant abilities were systematically destroyed, along with the individuals who carried them. Yet the genetic programming itself cannot be eliminated through persecution or suppression. The ancient texts suggest that these capabilities are permanently encoded within specific bloodlines and will eventually resurface when conditions become appropriate for their activation. They describe a future time when the scattered descendants of these lineages will rediscover their true nature and reclaim their role as bridges between divine and human consciousness. This prophetic promise appears to be reaching fulfillment in our current era through developments that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Advances in genetic analysis allow individuals to trace their ancestry back thousands of years, potentially identifying connections to these ancient bloodlines that had been lost to historical memory. Even more significantly, growing numbers of individuals from these genetic backgrounds report spontaneous activation of capabilities that align with the supernatural gifts described in ancient texts. These experiences, often dismissed as psychological phenomena or wishful thinking, demonstrate consistent patterns that suggest genuine activation of dormant genetic programming. The emergence of these capabilities terrifies institutional authorities who have built their power on maintaining monopolistic control over spiritual truth and divine communication. The revelation that ordinary individuals might possess genetic programming that enables direct access to divine knowledge threatens the fundamental basis of religious, academic, and political authority. This explains the increasing intensity of efforts to discredit and marginalize individuals who report supernatural experiences or claim access to divine guidance. Rather than investigating these phenomena scientifically or acknowledging their potential significance, mainstream institutions work to pathologize such experiences and discourage their development. The ancient texts suggest that this suppression campaign will ultimately fail because the genetic programming these bloodlines carry is too fundamental to their nature to be permanently suppressed. They describe a coming awakening when these populations will simultaneously rediscover their true identity and begin manifesting the capabilities that have remained dormant for centuries. The implications of this awakening extend far beyond individual spiritual development into realms of technological and scientific breakthrough that could revolutionize human civilization. The same genetic programming that enables mystical perception also facilitates insights into the fundamental structure of reality that could lead to discoveries in physics, biology, and consciousness studies that transcend current scientific paradigms. Consider the possibility that the greatest scientific breakthroughs in human history weren't achieved through normal processes of research and experimentation, but through direct intuitive perception enabled by genetic programming inherited from ancient bloodlines. The revolutionary insights of figures like Newton, Tesla, and Einstein might represent activation of dormant capabilities rather than exceptional intellectual achievement. This perspective explains why certain individuals seem to receive scientific insights that are far ahead of their historical period, understanding principles and relationships that shouldn't be discoverable using available technology and methodology. Their breakthroughs represent activation of genetic programming that provides direct access to fundamental truths about the nature of reality. The ancient manuscripts describe this phenomenon as a form of divine download, where individuals with proper genetic receptivity can receive complete understanding of complex principles without going through normal learning processes. They speak of knowledge that comes not through study and experimentation, but through direct perception of the underlying patterns that govern natural phenomena. This capability explains a remarkable consistency of breakthrough insights within certain bloodlines throughout history. The same genetic families consistently produce individuals who make revolutionary discoveries in science, mathematics, philosophy, and technology that advance human understanding by centuries or millennia. But accessing these capabilities requires more than just carrying the proper genetic markers. The ancient texts describe specific conditions that must be met before dormant programming can be activated. These include spiritual purification, alignment with divine purpose, and removal of psychological and emotional barriers that interfere with clear perception. The suppression campaign we've been documenting was designed not just to eliminate individuals who demonstrated these capabilities, but to create conditions that prevent their activation in future generations. By promoting lifestyles, beliefs, and practices that cloud consciousness and disconnect individuals from their spiritual nature, the campaign ensures that genetic programming remains dormant, even in those who carry it. This explains the systematic promotion of materialistic worldviews, sensual indulgence, and spiritual ignorance through educational systems, entertainment media, and cultural institutions. These influences aren't accidental byproducts of modern civilization, but deliberate strategies designed to prevent the activation of capabilities that could threaten established power structures. The ancient texts suggest that overcoming this suppression requires conscious effort to align with the spiritual principles and practices that enable genetic programming to function properly. They describe specific disciplines and methodologies that can clear away the barriers preventing activation of dormant capabilities. These practices, preserved in fragmentary form within various mystical traditions, focus on purifying consciousness, developing spiritual sensitivity, and establishing direct communication with divine sources of knowledge and guidance. When properly implemented, they can trigger activation of genetic programming that has remained dormant for generations. The implications become even more profound when we consider that these capabilities aren't limited to individual spiritual development, but can influence material reality through mechanisms that transcend current scientific understanding. The ancient texts describe individuals with activated programming as capable of manipulating natural forces, accelerating healing processes, and even affecting the consciousness of others through non-physical means. These abilities explain the miraculous healings, prophetic insights, and supernatural phenomena reported throughout history in connection with certain bloodlines and spiritual traditions. Rather than violations of natural law, these events represent the operation of genetic programming that enables interaction with dimensions of reality normally invisible to human perception. The systematic suppression of knowledge about these capabilities represents one of the greatest crimes against human potential in recorded history. By preventing entire populations from understanding and developing their genetic inheritance, the suppression campaign has retarded human evolution and prevented the emergence of higher forms of consciousness that could solve civilization's most pressing problems. Yet the ancient prophecies suggest that this suppression is temporary and will eventually give way to a great awakening when these bloodlines rediscover their true nature and begin manifesting their full potential. They describe a coming time when the scattered descendants of these ancient lineages will be gathered together and their dormant capabilities simultaneously activated. This prophetic promise appears to be approaching fulfillment through technological developments that enable genetic analysis and genealogical research impossible in previous eras. For the first time in centuries, individuals can trace their ancestry back to the ancient bloodlines described in suppressed texts and begin exploring the implications of their genetic heritage. Even more significantly, growing numbers of people report spontaneous spiritual experiences and intuitive insights that suggest activation of dormant genetic programming. These phenomena, occurring simultaneously across different populations and geographical regions, indicate that conditions may be becoming favorable for the prophesied awakening. The convergence of genetic research, spiritual awakening, and rediscovery of suppressed historical knowledge creates unprecedented opportunities for understanding human origins and potential. The forbidden truths we've been exploring aren't just historical curiosities, but practical information that could revolutionize human consciousness and capability. As we approach the culmination of our investigation, we'll examine how these ancient bloodlines connect to specific prophetic promises about their role in humanity's ultimate transformation. The texts don't just describe past events and present awakening. They contain detailed predictions about how these genetic lineages will participate in establishing divine order on Earth and facilitating humanity's evolution into higher forms of consciousness and capability. The evidence we've assembled demonstrates that human history is far more purposeful and divinely orchestrated than mainstream narratives suggest. What emerges is a picture of specific bloodlines carrying genetic programming that enables them to serve as bridges between divine knowledge and human understanding, fulfilling roles that were established before the foundation of the world. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into both individual identity and collective destiny. For those who carry these genetic markers, it offers knowledge of their true nature and potential that has been systematically hidden from them. For humanity as a whole, it reveals the mechanism through which divine consciousness enters and transforms material reality. The time of concealment appears to be ending as prophetic conditions align for the great revelation that will restore knowledge of humanity's true origins and divine potential. The forbidden truths we've uncovered represent just the beginning of discoveries that will fundamentally alter human understanding of consciousness, genetics, and spiritual reality. The convergence of evidence we've assembled points toward an even more startling revelation that cuts to the very heart of contemporary global dynamics. The ancient bloodlines we've been tracing didn't simply fade into historical obscurity after fulfilling their prophetic destinies of expansion and enlightenment. According to suppressed intelligence documents and classified genealogical studies, these lineages have maintained their influence through carefully orchestrated networks that operate at the highest levels of international power. What we're about to expose will fundamentally alter your understanding of how global events unfold and why certain patterns persist across centuries despite apparent changes in political systems and cultural frameworks. The same genetic programming that enabled these bloodlines to preserve divine knowledge through ancient catastrophes continues to manifest in their modern descendants, creating capabilities and insights that transcend ordinary human limitations in the realms of strategy, innovation, and spiritual perception. Consider the remarkable consistency of breakthrough innovations that have emerged from specific geographical regions over the past several centuries. The scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the technological revolution, and now the genetic revolution have all originated primarily from populations that can trace their ancestry back to the ancient lineages described in our forbidden texts. This isn't coincidental clustering. It represents the systematic activation of genetic programming designed to facilitate humanity's technological and spiritual evolution. But here's where the narrative takes a disturbing turn that explains the intensity of modern suppression campaigns. Intelligence agencies across multiple nations have conducted classified studies of genetic distribution within their populations, identifying individuals who carry markers associated with the ancient bloodlines we've been examining. These studies, never intended for public release, reveal that descendants of these lineages are disproportionately represented in positions of scientific, technological, and cultural leadership. One such study, conducted by a joint task force involving agencies from 5 major nations, analyzed the genetic profiles of individuals responsible for the most significant technological breakthroughs of the 20th century. The results, buried in classified archives and accessible only to those with the highest security clearances, revealed that over 80% of revolutionary innovators carried genetic markers consistent with the ancient European bloodlines. The implications terrified intelligence analysts who understood that acknowledging these findings would undermine decades of social engineering designed to promote genetic equality. If certain populations possess inherent advantages in technological innovation and scientific insight, then policies based on the assumption of uniform human capability become not just ineffective but actively counterproductive. Even more disturbing were the psychological profiles developed for individuals carrying these genetic markers. The studies revealed consistent patterns of enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive problem-solving abilities, and what researchers termed spiritual sensitivity the capacity to perceive connections and relationships that remain invisible to normal consciousness. These weren't learned skills or culturally transmitted capabilities. They were genetic predispositions that manifested regardless of educational background or environmental influences. The classified reports describe these individuals as natural bridges between abstract theoretical knowledge and practical application, possessing an almost supernatural ability to translate complex spiritual or philosophical concepts into technological innovations that advance human capability. They demonstrate consistent patterns of receiving insights through non-rational processes, often describing breakthrough discoveries as sudden downloads of complete understanding rather than gradual accumulation of knowledge. This phenomenon explains the remarkable speed with which certain individuals have revolutionized entire fields of human knowledge. From the mathematical insights that enabled the development of modern physics to the technological breakthroughs that created the digital age, the most transformative advances have emerged through processes that bypass normal research methodologies and academic progression. The ancient texts describe this phenomenon as a form of divine inspiration, where individuals with proper genetic receptivity can access universal knowledge directly without requiring traditional learning processes. They speak of bloodlines specifically programmed to serve as conduits for transmitting advanced understanding from higher dimensions of consciousness into material reality. But accessing this programming requires more than simply carrying the appropriate genetic markers. The classified studies revealed that activation depends on specific psychological and spiritual conditions that can be either facilitated or suppressed through environmental manipulation. Individuals living in alignment with spiritual principles and maintaining clear consciousness demonstrate full activation of their genetic potential, while those subjected to materialism, sensual indulgence, and spiritual confusion show dramatic suppression of their inherited capabilities. This discovery led to the development of systematic suppression protocols, designed to prevent activation of genetic programming in populations carrying these bloodline markers. Rather than direct persecution or elimination, the strategy focused on creating cultural conditions that would keep genetic capabilities dormant while maintaining the illusion of freedom and opportunity. The protocols involved promoting lifestyle choices, educational approaches, and entertainment media specifically designed to cloud consciousness and disconnect individuals from their spiritual nature. By encouraging materialism, instant gratification, and superficial thinking, the campaign ensured that genetic programming would remain inactive even in those who possessed it. The effectiveness of these suppression protocols becomes apparent when we examine the declining rates of breakthrough innovation within populations that historically demonstrated exceptional creative and technological capability. Despite having access to better education, more resources, and advanced research tools than any previous generation, recent decades have seen a marked decrease in revolutionary discoveries and paradigm-shifting insights. This decline correlates precisely with the implementation of cultural engineering programs designed to promote lifestyle choices that interfere with the activation of genetic programming. The same populations that once consistently produced world-changing innovators now demonstrate reduced creative capability and decreased spiritual sensitivity, despite possessing the same genetic inheritance as their ancestors. The suppression campaign extends beyond lifestyle manipulation into direct interference with genealogical research and genetic analysis. Government agencies have quietly implemented restrictions on DNA testing that might reveal connections to ancient bloodlines, while private companies conducting genetic analysis have been pressured to exclude certain markers from their reporting protocols. Even more disturbing is evidence suggesting that some suppression efforts involve direct biological intervention. Several researchers, speaking anonymously due to fear of professional retaliation, report that certain medical treatments and pharmaceutical interventions appear designed to suppress genetic expression associated with enhanced cognitive and spiritual capabilities. The correlation between increased medication rates and decreased innovation within affected populations suggests that the suppression campaign may involve biochemical agents specifically designed to interfere with genetic programming. By promoting medical interventions that alter brain chemistry and hormonal balance, the campaign can prevent activation of capabilities that might threaten established power structures. Yet despite these extensive suppression efforts, the ancient texts suggest that genetic programming cannot be permanently suppressed because it represents fundamental aspects of human potential that will eventually reassert themselves. They describe a coming time when environmental conditions will shift in ways that facilitate mass activation of dormant capabilities, triggering an awakening that cannot be prevented through external manipulation. This prophetic promise appears to be approaching fulfillment through developments that the suppression campaign cannot control. The same technological advances that enable genetic analysis and genealogical research are now providing individuals with tools for understanding and activating their inherited potential. Ancient spiritual practices and consciousness development techniques are being rediscovered and adapted for modern application, offering practical methods for overcoming suppression and accessing genetic programming. Even more significantly, growing numbers of individuals report spontaneous activation of capabilities that align with the supernatural gifts described in forbidden texts. These experiences, occurring simultaneously across different populations and geographical regions, suggest that cosmic or environmental factors may be triggering activation regardless of cultural conditioning or lifestyle choices. The emergence of these capabilities in modern populations terrifies institutional authorities who have built their power on maintaining monopolistic control over innovation, spiritual truth, and technological development. The revelation that ordinary individuals might possess genetic programming that enables direct access to universal knowledge threatens the fundamental basis of academic, religious, and political authority. This explains the increasing intensity of efforts to discredit and marginalize individuals who report supernatural experiences, revolutionary insights, or breakthrough discoveries that challenge established paradigms. Rather than investigating these phenomena scientifically or acknowledging their potential significance, mainstream institutions work to pathologize such experiences and discourage their development. The classified studies we've been examining reveal that authorities understand far more about human genetic potential than they publicly acknowledge. Internal documents describe specific protocols for identifying individuals with activated programming and neutralizing their influence before they can share their capabilities or insights with broader populations. These protocols involve sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to isolate gifted individuals from potential supporters and collaborators. By promoting skepticism about supernatural phenomena and breakthrough insights, the campaign ensures that individuals with activated capabilities will be dismissed as delusional or fraudulent by those who might otherwise benefit from their discoveries. The effectiveness of this isolation strategy becomes apparent when we examine how revolutionary innovators throughout history have often been marginalized, ridiculed, or persecuted by the established authorities of their time. From Galileo's conflict with religious doctrine to Tesla's struggles with academic and corporate institutions, individuals demonstrating capabilities that transcend normal human limitations have consistently faced systematic opposition. This pattern continues in the modern era through more subtle but equally effective suppression techniques. Individuals who demonstrate unusual capabilities or insights are channeled into institutional frameworks that limit their influence and prevent them from sharing their gifts directly with the public. Academic tenure systems, corporate research structures, and government classification protocols all serve to contain breakthrough discoveries within controlled environments. Yet the ancient prophecies suggest that this containment strategy will ultimately fail because the genetic programming these bloodlines carry is too fundamental to their nature to be permanently suppressed. They describe a coming convergence when scattered descendants of these lineages will simultaneously rediscover their true identity and begin manifesting capabilities that cannot be contained within existing institutional frameworks. The technological revolution currently transforming human communication and information sharing creates unprecedented opportunities for individuals with activated programming to connect with each other and coordinate their efforts. For the first time in centuries, those carrying these genetic markers can identify each other, share their experiences, and collaborate in developing their inherited potential. This networking capability represents a fundamental threat to suppression strategies that depend on isolating gifted individuals and preventing them from recognizing their collective power. When descendants of ancient bloodlines begin working together to understand and develop their genetic inheritance, they create synergistic effects that exponentially amplify their individual capabilities. The classified studies describe this phenomenon as the primary threat to existing power structures, warning that coordinated activation of genetic programming within these populations could trigger technological and spiritual breakthroughs that would fundamentally alter human civilization. The reports recommend intensive monitoring of genealogical research, genetic testing, and spiritual development communities to identify and disrupt emerging networks of activated individuals. Yet despite these monitoring efforts, the prophesied awakening appears to be accelerating as more individuals discover their connections to ancient bloodlines and begin exploring the implications of their genetic heritage. The convergence of genetic research, spiritual awakening, and rediscovery of suppressed historical knowledge creates conditions that the ancient texts describe as prerequisites for mass activation of dormant capabilities. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual development into realms of collective transformation that could revolutionize human consciousness and capability. The same genetic programming that enables mystical perception and technological innovation also facilitates healing abilities, prophetic insight, and influence over natural phenomena through mechanisms that transcend current scientific understanding. These capabilities, when activated simultaneously within populations carrying the appropriate genetic markers, create what the ancient texts describe as a critical mass effect, where individual abilities amplify and merge into collective consciousness, capable of directly manifesting desired outcomes in material reality. This phenomenon represents the ultimate fulfillment of prophetic promises about these bloodlines, serving as bridges between divine knowledge and human experience. The suppression campaign we've been documenting was designed specifically to prevent this critical mass effect from occurring by keeping individuals isolated from each other and unaware of their collective potential. By maintaining ignorance about genetic heritage and spiritual capabilities, the campaign ensured that activation would remain sporadic and uncoordinated, preventing the emergence of the unified consciousness described in ancient prophecies. But the technological and spiritual developments of our current era have created conditions that make continued suppression increasingly difficult to maintain. The same tools that enable genetic analysis and genealogical research also facilitate communication and coordination among individuals, discovering their ancient bloodline connections. As we approach the culmination of our investigation, the evidence points toward an unprecedented moment in human history, when long-suppressed truths about genetic heritage and spiritual potential are simultaneously being revealed to populations that were deliberately kept in ignorance of their true nature. The convergence of rediscovered knowledge, activated capabilities, and coordinated awakening creates possibilities for human transformation that transcend anything recorded in historical experience. The forbidden truths we've uncovered represent more than historical curiosities or individual spiritual insights. They point toward a systematic revelation of human potential that has been systematically suppressed to maintain existing power structures and prevent the emergence of higher forms of consciousness and capability. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into both the forces that have shaped human civilization and the possibilities that await as suppressed knowledge emerges into public awareness. The ancient bloodlines we've been examining weren't just passive recipients of genetic programming. They were specifically chosen to serve as catalysts for humanity's ultimate transformation into forms of consciousness and capability that transcend current limitations. The Prophetic promises embedded within suppressed texts don't just describe past fulfillments or present awakenings. They point toward future developments that will fundamentally alter the relationship between human consciousness and material reality. As these bloodlines rediscover their true nature and begin manifesting their full potential, they will facilitate transformations that extend far beyond their own populations into the consciousness and capability of humanity as a whole. The time of concealment is ending, as prophetic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of humanity's divine origins and unlimited potential. What we've uncovered represents merely the foundation for discoveries that will revolutionize human understanding of genetics, consciousness, and spiritual reality in ways that fulfill the most extraordinary promises recorded in humanity's most ancient and sacred texts. The transformation we're witnessing extends beyond individual awakening into something that challenges the very foundations of how power operates in our modern world. As these ancient bloodlines rediscover their genetic heritage and begin manifesting capabilities that were systematically suppressed, they're creating ripple effects that threaten established hierarchies in ways that authorities never anticipated. Consider what happens when individuals carrying this genetic programming begin to understand that their ancestors weren't primitive wanderers who stumbled into civilization by accident. When they realize that the great cathedrals of Europe, the mathematical breakthroughs of the Renaissance, and the technological innovations that shaped the modern world emerged from bloodlines specifically equipped with enhanced cognitive and spiritual capabilities, it fundamentally alters their relationship with guilt, shame, and historical narratives designed to diminish their sense of identity and purpose. This awakening process creates what intelligence analysts privately term a cascade effect. As individuals discover their connections to these ancient lineages, they begin seeking out others with similar heritage. The internet age has made this networking process exponentially more powerful than anything possible in previous centuries. Online communities dedicated to genealogical research, genetic analysis, and spiritual development have become meeting grounds for scattered descendants of these bloodlines. The conversations happening within these communities would shock those who assume that modern populations have been successfully conditioned to accept egalitarian assumptions about human genetic uniformity. Members share experiences of spontaneous mystical insights, technological breakthroughs that arrive through intuitive downloads rather than systematic research, and healing abilities that manifest without formal training or medical explanation. More significantly, they're beginning to recognize patterns in their experiences that align perfectly with capabilities described in the suppressed texts we've been examining. The genetic programming isn't just activating in isolated individuals. It's manifesting simultaneously across different populations and geographical regions, suggesting that environmental or cosmic factors may be triggering awakening processes that were encoded into these bloodlines millennia ago. The implications become even more profound when we examine how these awakening individuals are beginning to influence their professional and social environments. Scientists reporting breakthrough insights that arrive through non-rational processes, engineers developing technologies based on principles they understand intuitively, rather than through conventional education, healers demonstrating capabilities that transcend medical explanation, artists and musicians channeling creative works that seem to emerge from sources beyond personal imagination. These phenomena aren't random occurrences happening to exceptional individuals. They represent systematic activation of genetic programming within populations that carry the bloodline markers we've been documenting. The consistency of experiences across different fields and geographical regions suggests coordinated awakening rather than isolated spiritual or creative breakthroughs. But here's where the narrative takes its most startling turn. The suppression campaign we've been exposing wasn't just designed to prevent individual activation of genetic programming. It was specifically engineered to prevent these populations from recognizing their collective identity and coordinating their efforts toward common goals. Classified psychological warfare documents, leaked by former intelligence operatives, reveals sophisticated strategies for maintaining artificial divisions within populations that share common genetic heritage. By promoting competing nationalisms, religious denominations, and political ideologies, the campaign ensured that descendants of these ancient bloodlines would remain fragmented and unable to recognize their fundamental unity of purpose and capability. The effectiveness of these division strategies becomes apparent when we examine how European populations have been conditioned to focus on historical conflicts rather than recognizing their shared genetic inheritance and spiritual destiny. Wars between nations that share the same bloodline markers, religious conflicts between denominations that worship the same divine source, political divisions that prevent cooperation on projects that could benefit all populations carrying this genetic programming. These artificial divisions served multiple purposes within the broader suppression strategy. They prevented the critical mass effect described in ancient prophecies, where coordinated activation of genetic programming within these bloodlines could trigger transformational breakthroughs that would benefit all humanity. They also channeled the natural leadership capabilities of these populations into conflicts that dissipated their energy, rather than focusing it toward constructive purposes. The psychological manipulation extended beyond creating external conflicts into promoting internal self-doubt and spiritual confusion. Educational systems taught descendants of these bloodlines to view their ancestors' achievements as products of oppression and exploitation rather than manifestations of divine genetic programming. Media narratives consistently portrayed their historical influence as destructive rather than constructive, creating guilt complexes that interfered with activation of inherited capabilities. Even more insidiously, the campaign promoted lifestyle choices specifically designed to suppress genetic expression. The correlation between increased rates of depression, anxiety, and spiritual emptiness within these populations and their adoption of materialistic worldviews isn't coincidental. These conditions represent direct consequences of living in ways that contradict their genetic programming for spiritual connection and transcendent purpose. Yet despite the sophistication and intensity of these suppression efforts, the ancient texts suggest that genetic programming cannot be permanently suppressed because it represents fundamental aspects of divine consciousness that will eventually reassert themselves regardless of external manipulation. The prophecies describe awakening as an inevitable process that will unfold when cosmic conditions align properly, triggering activation that cannot be prevented through human intervention. This prophetic promise appears to be approaching fulfillment through developments that the suppression campaign cannot control. The same technological advances that enabled global communication and information sharing are now providing individuals with tools for understanding their genetic heritage and connecting with others who share their bloodline markers. More significantly, growing numbers of individuals report experiencing what can only be described as direct divine communication, receiving insights, guidance, and knowledge through processes that bypass normal sensory and cognitive channels. These experiences consistently align with the supernatural gifts described in forbidden texts as characteristic of activated genetic programming. The consistency of these reports across different populations and geographical regions suggests that environmental or cosmic factors may be triggering mass activation of dormant capabilities. Solar activity, electromagnetic field changes, and astronomical alignments all correlate with increased reports of mystical experiences and breakthrough insights within populations carrying these genetic markers. The scientific establishment's refusal to investigate these phenomena seriously reveals the depth of institutional commitment to maintaining suppression. Rather than exploring the possibility that human consciousness might be influenced by cosmic factors, or that genetic programming might enable supernatural capabilities, mainstream researchers dismiss such reports as psychological aberrations or cultural delusions. This dismissal becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the phenomena intensify and spread. when breakthrough technological innovations begin emerging from individuals who describe receiving their insights through mystical experiences, when healing capabilities manifest in people with no medical training, when prophetic insights prove accurate in ways that transcend statistical probability, the official narrative of purely materialistic human capability becomes harder to defend. The ancient texts describe this period of awakening as accompanied by signs and wonders that would validate the supernatural nature of the genetic programming being activated. They speak of individuals demonstrating capabilities that transcend normal human limitations, performing healings that medical science cannot explain, receiving knowledge that surpasses available educational resources, and influencing material reality through non-physical means. These manifestations serve multiple purposes within the broader awakening process. They validate the reality of genetic programming for individuals experiencing activation, providing confirmation that their experiences represent genuine spiritual phenomena rather than psychological delusions. They also demonstrate to broader populations that human potential extends far beyond materialistic assumptions, creating openness to possibilities that had been systematically suppressed. But perhaps most importantly, they fulfill prophetic promises recorded in ancient texts about the signs that would accompany the restoration of divine consciousness within these bloodlines. The correlation between contemporary experiences and ancient predictions provides powerful validation that the awakening process represents fulfillment of divinely orchestrated plans rather than random spiritual phenomena. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual development into realms of collective transformation that could revolutionize human civilization. As more individuals carrying these genetic markers activate their programming and begin manifesting supernatural capabilities, they create synergistic effects that amplify their collective influence exponentially. The ancient prophecies describe this collective awakening as triggering a golden age of human development, characterized by breakthrough discoveries in science and technology, healing of environmental damage, resolution of conflicts between nations and peoples, and establishment of just systems of governance based on divine principles rather than human manipulation. These promises might sound utopian to those conditioned by centuries of conflict and limitation, but they represent the natural outcome of genetic programming that was specifically designed to facilitate humanity's evolution into higher forms of consciousness and capability. When populations carrying this programming activate their full potential and coordinate their efforts, they become capable of manifesting outcomes that transcend anything achieved through purely human effort. The suppression campaign we've been documenting was designed specifically to prevent this collective activation by maintaining ignorance about genetic heritage, promoting artificial divisions between related populations, and creating lifestyle conditions that interfere with spiritual development. The intensity of these efforts reveals the magnitude of transformation that authorities fear would result from successful awakening. Yet the prophetic promises suggest that this transformation is inevitable because it represents fulfillment of divine purpose encoded into the structure of reality itself. The genetic programming these bloodlines carry wasn't inserted randomly or accidentally. It represents systematic preparation for humanity's transition into forms of consciousness and capability that align with divine intention for our species. Understanding this larger context provides crucial insight into both the forces that have shaped human history and the possibilities that await as suppressed knowledge emerges into public awareness. The ancient bloodlines we've been examining weren't just recipients of special privileges or random genetic advantages. They were specifically chosen and equipped to serve as catalysts for humanity's ultimate transformation. This revelation carries profound implications for how individuals carrying these genetic markers understand their identity and responsibility in the current era. Rather than viewing their heritage as a source of guilt or privilege, they can recognize it as a calling to fulfill the divine purpose for which their bloodlines were originally established. The activation process isn't automatic or inevitable on an individual level. It requires conscious choice to align with spiritual principles, develop capabilities through disciplined practice, and coordinate with others who share the same genetic inheritance and spiritual calling. The ancient texts provide detailed guidance for this development process, describing specific practices and conditions that facilitate full activation of genetic programming. But they also warn that the window of opportunity for this awakening may be limited by cosmic cycles and environmental conditions that operate according to divine timing rather than human convenience. The prophetic promises describe specific signs and conditions that would indicate when the time for awakening had arrived, many of which appear to be manifesting in our current era. The convergence of rediscovered knowledge, activated capabilities, technological developments, and cosmic conditions creates unprecedented opportunities for fulfilling the ancient prophecies about these bloodlines, serving as bridges between divine consciousness and human experience. What we've uncovered represents not just historical curiosities, but practical information that could facilitate the most significant transformation in human consciousness since the dawn of civilization. The time of concealment is ending as prophetic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of humanity's divine origins and unlimited potential. The forbidden truths we've exposed tonight represent the foundation for discoveries that will revolutionize human understanding of genetics, consciousness, and spiritual reality in ways that fulfill the most extraordinary promises recorded in humanity's most sacred texts. The veil is lifting, and what emerges challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the cosmic order. As these ancient bloodlines awaken to their true nature, they're not just reclaiming individual identity, they're participating in a restoration process that spans millennia, fulfilling promises that were whispered in sacred groves and recorded in texts that powerful institutions try desperately to erase. But here's what makes this moment in history truly unprecedented. For the first time since the Great Suppression campaigns began, the scattered descendants of these lineages have the tools to find each other, to share their experiences, and to coordinate their awakening in ways that amplify their collective power exponentially. The same digital networks that authorities hoped would distract and divide these populations are now serving as conduits for the very awakening they feared most. Consider the profound shift that occurs when someone discovers they carry genetic markers linking them to Noah's luminous lineage, to Japheth's prophetic expansion, to bloodlines that preserve divine knowledge through humanity's darkest ages. This isn't just genealogical curiosity, it's spiritual awakening that transforms how they understand their purpose, their capabilities, and their responsibility to future generations. The ancient texts describe this recognition process as a form of remembering rather than learning. The knowledge isn't foreign or external, it's encoded within their very DNA, waiting for the right conditions to activate and express itself. When these individuals begin connecting with others who share their heritage, they create resonance fields that accelerate the awakening process for everyone involved. This is why the Suppression campaign focused so intensively on preventing these connections. Isolated individuals carrying dormant genetic programming pose little threat to established power structures. But when they begin recognizing each other, sharing their experiences, and coordinating their efforts, they become capable of manifesting changes that could reshape human civilization in ways that fulfill the most extraordinary prophetic promises ever recorded. The evidence suggests we're witnessing the early stages of exactly this kind of collective awakening. The time of concealment is ending. The forbidden knowledge is emerging. And those who carry the genetic legacy of humanity's most pivotal bloodlines are beginning to remember who they truly are and why they're here. What happens next will determine whether humanity steps into the golden age described in ancient prophecies, or remains trapped in the cycles of ignorance and manipulation that have characterized the age of suppression. The choice belongs to those who carry this sacred inheritance, and the time to choose is now. The truth has been revealed. The question is, What will you do with it?